The past isn't dead, it's within us. Sounds a bit crazy, doesn't it? Finally lost his marbles. Last week, what was I talking about? Belief systems, and this week it's about the past. Well, a great human being died a few days ago, Jack Mundy. Now, most of you wouldn't know who Jack Mundy was, and I don't blame you. And you wouldn't know who Joe Owens was, or Bob Pringle was. Now, obviously, you know all the Prime Ministers of Australia, and Gina Reinhardt, and Twiggy, and Mr Stokes, and Mr Keating, and Mr Whitlam, you know all those people. But as luck would have it, three of the most important people in Australian history, three of the most important people in the 1970s have now left us. Well, they've died, okay? I'm not one of these people who talks about people passing over or have left us. They've died. Now, Jack Mundy died on the 10th of May this year. Joe Owens died in 2012. And Bob Pringle died he drowned in 1996 on the New South Wales Central Coast. So why are these men so important, or should be important figures in Australian history? Well, these men changed the way that trade unions had acted for over 150 years. Now, Jack Mundy, who died a few days ago, was born in Malanda. That's 100 kilometres west of Cairns in the Atherton Tablelands in far north Queensland in 1929. He was one of 5 children. His mother died when he was 6. He went to Malanda Primary School and then moved across to St Augustine's as a boarder in Cairns, and found the discipline hard to take and ran away from school. He found himself in Sydney at the beginning of the war, aged 18, took up metalwork, and then eventually drifted into construction as a builder's labourer. Now, I don't think most Australians realise how difficult conditions were for builders labourers in the late 1960s and early 1970s. When I first came to Melbourne in 1970, I was looking for work and I was told, all you've got to do is stand on a street corner. And I thought, this sounds interesting, but a specific street corner. So I stood on this specific street corner with about 100 other men, and a truck came trundled past at about 6:30 a.m. A bloke jumped out of the truck and said, you, and people jumped on the truck, and I said, what was all that about? And they said, well, they're looking for builders labourers around the place. So builders labourers were basically at the bottom of the pile as far as the workplace were concerned. They were piecemeal workers who employers picked and choose the more docile ones, and those with a little bit to go were basically left to starve. That's the reality. Now, Jack Mundy was a member of the Communist Party. He joined the Communist Party in 1957, and he was elected Secretary of the New South Wales Division of the Builders Labourers Federation in 1968. Now, things were changing in 1968. And the builders labourers across Australia, the various branches of the various states had federated and were involved in many campaigns to improve workers' conditions and wages. And they used very militant tactics, because the construction industry was a tough industry. It was basically in the late 1960s, early 1970s, run by criminals and corrupt governments. And especially in New South Wales, where the Askin-led Liberal government and the New South Wales right were as corrupt can be. Corruption was their name, and they were involved in overdevelopment and specific construction blitzes around Sydney. Well, in 1968, when Jack Mundy was elected, as Secretary of the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, Bob Pringle and Joe Owens were elected as his deputies, and they transformed the New South Wales branch of the Builders Labourers Federation within 2 to 3 years into a solid, strong union that used black bands to improve workers' rights and conditions, and used grey bands, which is partial lockdowns on building sites, to improve their members' rights and conditions. But they did one very important thing which the other Builders Labourers Federations didn't do across Australia. They introduced the concept of industrial democracy into the union, and the rank and file was heavily involved in formulating policies and determining tactics. It was a union which was based on direct democratic principles, although led by Jack Mundy and Bob Pringle and Joe Owens. It relied on its membership to determine its direction. In 1970, something unheard of happened. A group of women, middle-class women and upper-class women from Hunters Hill in Sydney, approached the Builders Labourers Federation. Could you imagine the day? They turn up at the Builders Labourers Federation headquarters, this militant, gum-chewing, spitting union in their frocks and hats, and they've turned up and they want assistance to save a park, Hunters Hill, a great green space with great views, which is used by the community, and they wanted assistance. So the Builders Labourers Federation, the New South Wales branch, decided to put a green ban on Hunters Hill. This was the first green ban that was actually instituted anywhere in this country, and possibly the first green ban instituted by a union anywhere in the world. And obviously it was called a green ban because the park was green. Okay? So they instituted this green ban to protect the park and prevent it from being overdeveloped. Now this ran contrary to normal union practice, because unions traditionally were interested in their members' conditions and wages. For the first time in union history, one of the first times in union history, workers voted to actually forego work on the construction site in favour of a green area for the people of Sydney. So this was a turnaround in the way unions worked. And for the next 5 years, the New South Wales Builders Federation, guided by its membership, not just by its leadership of Mundy, Owens and Pringle, but guided by its membership, changed the nature of traditional trade unionism to incorporate workers' living conditions and amenities in their campaigns. And they began to slap green bands all over Sydney and parts of New South Wales. They even forced the Maoist-led Builders Labourers Federation in Victoria to follow their example. And they did this not because they were interested in heritage. They did this because they wanted to protect traditional working class areas in central Sydney, which had been earmarked for massive development. Areas like the Rocks, Victoria Street. They also formed links, and this is in the early 1970s, with the emerging Black Power movement in Redfern, and put a black ban, B-L-A-K, not B-L-A-C-K, a black ban on the New South Wales Housing Department, trying to racially cleanse Redfern of its Indigenous population. And to a large degree, the fact that Redfern still exists, parts of Redfern still exist as an Indigenous hub, is directly related to the introduction of those bans. And interestingly, in 1974, they also put a pink ban, and this is when homosexuality was illegal in all of Australia. They put a pink ban on a construction site at the University of Sydney because an openly gay member of a college had been expelled because he was gay. So this was a union that was looking at workers' conditions outside of the traditional workplace. This was a branch of a union which was causing waves across the country. This was a branch of a union that took on the corrupt Askin government, took on the corrupt right wing of the Labor Party. It took on the gangsters that were involved in development all across Sydney. It took on the newspapers, it took on Murdoch, it took on the gutter press, it took on the ABC, it formed alliances of more radical young students in Sydney and changed the face of unionism. Unfortunately, Bob Hawke, who led the ACTU in the late 1970s, was a little bit concerned about the ruckus which the New South Wales branch of the Builders Labourers Federation was causing, because they weren't sticking to traditional so-called union activities. Because the New South Wales branch believed that their workers deserved the same amenities and the same housing security as everybody else. And it wasn't just a matter of a job and a wage at the end of the week, it was a matter of how they lived and in what conditions they and their families lived. Because they understood it doesn't matter how much money you've got, if you're removed from your traditional places where you live, your cultural milieu is broken and things change dramatically forever. In many places that we traditionally now think of heritage listed sites, we're actually saved because of the work of the BLF, especially the New South Wales branch. And as I said before, its most important reform was incorporating the membership into decision-making process. Workplace democracy, industrial democracy was the strength of the New South Wales branch. Although the Victorian branch of the Builders Labourers Federation, headed by Norm Gallagher at that particular time, was also a significant presence in the trade union movement and made great gains for its members, and had introduced some green bans in Victoria, including stopping the development of Bakeries Hill, the site in Ballarat where the Eureka Oath was taken on the 29th of November 1854. The Victorian branch was based more on a hierarchical structure where there was the leader, there were the members, there was minimal industrial democracy, and in 1975, after a great deal of pressure from the ACTU, the National Federation of the Builders Labourers Federation, which was led by Norm Gallagher, decided to disaffiliate the New South Wales branch, and a convoy of cars moved from Victoria to New South Wales to take over the office. And I think nobody has forgotten that. But this is the classical situation people don't understand. People say to me, why don't you support, communists or Marxists or Leninists? And I say, why should I support them? What we had in New South Wales was libertarian communism or libertarian socialism. A socialism or a communism or a collectivism which was based on the concept of democracy and freedom. What we had in Victoria was a more authoritarian model, a top-down model, not a bottom-up model, not a rank-and-file led model. And once the New South Wales branch was destroyed in 1975, the more libertarian elements, the libertarian socialist elements within the BLF here in Victoria were driven out of the union. Paradoxically, almost a decade later, Norm Gallagher faces a few months in jail for so-called corruption, but more importantly, the Kane-led Labor government disaffiliated, closed down the Victorian branch of the BLF. So if there's a moral in the story, is never do the bosses work for them. So why is it important today? Why should we remember the thousands of builders, labourers who were involved in that extraordinary period in 1975 where the community and the union were one, where radical elements and the community were one, where gay people and the union were one, where Indigenous First Nations people and the union were one. Because what Mundy and Owens and Pringle taught us is that you cannot win the struggle against capitalism or corporations dominating every aspect of our ability by sticking to our own rigid formulas. We need to break down those boundaries, and we need to form coalitions with groups around us who find themselves in a similar position. Unfortunately, in 2020, things have changed dramatically. Those in power have learnt their lessons. The mass occupations which occurred in the 1970s in most cities in this country are now illegal, and you can be jailed up for 25 years for being involved in an occupation. It is illegal to strike in this country outside an enterprise bargaining period after a long, convoluted process. Individual workers can now be fined up to $10,000 a day for being involved in a wildcat strike. So the laws have been changed to prevent the type of activities which the New South Wales branch of the Builders Labourers Federation pursued in the 1950s. And the only way to break these laws is through mass disobedience. And that's the problem we face today. As the COVID-19 health crisis draws closer and closer to conclusion and the economic crisis begins to take precedence, we are hearing the same Liberal National Party and Australian Labor Party rhetoric about increasing deregulation, rhetoric about decreasing taxation, company taxes, rhetoric of removing the extra payments, JobKeeper and JobSeeker, rhetoric about the debt of $1 trillion having to be paid by ordinary people in this country. So what we need to consider today is acts of mass disobedience. Not disobedience by 1 or 2 or 3 people, but mass disobedience, because ultimately, whose country is it? They think it's their country. We know that is always Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We know that we now are here working together with First Nations people. We know that if we want to enjoy the bounty of this land, it is a very bountiful land. We are some of the luckiest people on the planet, 25 million people living on a resource-rich continent. And of all people on this planet who should be able to make a go and create an egalitarian community where wealth and power is shared, this is us. This is our moment. It is time that we took advantage of it, and we took a leaf out of the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation, looked at direct democracy, looked at workplace democracy, looked at direct action, and attempted to make the changes that are needed today. So if you haven't joined PIPSI, think about it. And if you want to join, download the application form. If you're not computer literate or you're not interested in computers, you can always write to me at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052, or ring me on 0439 395 489. We're not stupid enough to think we're going to be the government or even have any members elected, but it's time now to discuss alternatives. It's no longer business as usual in this country.